The following is a local resident producer's program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of Oshkosh Media, the City of Oshkosh, or your video service provider.
Third of four presentations with our summer speaker series. We're glad to have Dr. Arzigian with us tonight. She is a senior research associate at the Mississippi Valley Archaeological Center, as well as a professor at UW-La Crosse. She'll be talking about the practice of prehistoric archaeology, sort of the critical thinking that has to go into that for, figuring out the story of the different eras of history before Europeans arrived on the continent. So we're looking forward to hearing from her, and we'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you. So can you guys hear me? So what I want to do, my topic is supposed to be about how we go about finding out about the past. And so I want to use the prehistory, because I'm a prehistoric archaeologist. I work with sites usually dealing with Native Americans prior to the time of European context. That's my main expertise, although it's been really interesting working here because I can see that historic era shifting and how the Ho-Chunk, when they were in this area, in fact, we're finding flakes from the Ho-Chunk, presumably, in our collections along with the other historic material. So there are some things that carry over from the pre-contact to the contact era, but a lot of the methodology of how to do something, how to find out, how do we know about the past, really is the same. And so I want to start off by using a modern item and see if you can figure out who knows what this is. Anybody recognize this? There should be some people who recognize what this is, right? So what is this? So how do you know that? What is your source, your basis? You're correct, but what is your basis for saying that? Because okay, yeah, that's how we find out, because they showed you somebody else using it. They had records of people in the historic era using these. They have pictures of soldiers with all these things and guns. They've got photographs. They've got people who still use them. So we have one basis for knowing about the past is documentation. This was used this is a plastic replica. These things were used a couple hundred years ago, but we know about them because we have written records in history. But we also have another very important source of information that extends to the past, which is for the historic area, we would call them some of these rendezvous or other kinds of reenactments, where people take some of these things and they try to use them. And with prehistory in particular, we have learned an enormous amount because we don't really know. We get to some of the other items here and we say, I don't know what those are. Let's try it out. But when reenactors use these, I would bet they come back with a much stronger understanding of what they are. How good are they? How useful are they? This has clearly a little plug at the bottom. I would bet that they discovered that was really important for not losing your gunpowder at the end. There's various different processes for attaching things. How useful are they? How do you use them? A lot of them comes from what we would call reenactment in history or experiments, experimental archaeology in the past. But let's take some of those same processes and look at an ancient artifact. Let's say you found, and some of you were looking at these earlier, so I'll just hold this up. I think I've just walked out of the camera's range, so we'll just go back there again. So if you found this, what does this look like? What might you use this for? What do you think?
Well, it looks like an axe or a hammer.
Yep. So you've got two different possibilities there. Hammer.
Or a wedge.
Yep. And this looks like an axe, right? It looks like it's kind of pointed. It has a flat edge. This is broken, but it's got kind of a flat edge there. It has a place where it could be hafted so that you could use it to chop down trees. So that's called analogy. There's no modern person using these unless you go back to some of the New Guinea tribes or other kinds of groups doing that. This is very heavy. You can come up later and you can feel this. Some of the full-size axes that were being made are 4 or 5 pounds. This is a heavy sucker if you want to cut down trees. And they were still using these up until European contact. It's hard. These are hard to use. One of the very first artifacts that Native Americans adopted was the axe, because they were efficient, they were lighter, they were so much better. But they had the exact same. This was made, this particular one was probably made about 8,000 years ago. It's got the exact same principles that we use with the modern axe. It's got a tapering end with a sharp bit. It's got a place to haft it, and the opposite side has a large rounded edge that you use for pounding. The exact same thing that you look on your hammer today or your axe today has the exact same process that Europeans developed completely independently, because there's a functional reason for doing some of these things. But we can figure out what this is by looking at modern axes. We say, well, I've got one that looks just like that in my garage. Okay, it works like this. I'll bet I can do it and make this one work too. So you can cut down a tree with this, although it's really pretty heavy, but it takes a lot more effort than it would to you cut down a tree with a metal axe. So we've got an analogy here. And we can draw analogies where we have a direct contact between the past and the present. Not put this on a sloping surface. So when I draw an analogy between my modern replica and the historic era, it only goes back maybe 100 years or 200 years or so. It's from the same kinds of people. It's from Western European people doing similar kinds of things. If we were to take this shape of a horn and ignoring all these pieces, and we went back into the Viking era, we might find that this, without the hole in the bottom, may have been a drinking horn. So when we draw analogies, we have to be careful that we're drawing them to a group that's even likely sort of going to be related. Or we draw it so we can say it's a specific analogy. This group is doing it now. These look similar. They were probably doing the same thing. We get to some things. This is a pretty universal tool, but we can draw kind of a general analogy. This is a functional analogy. This is how things work. We can do things like that. So we can draw analogies to the past, and we can do experiments to figure out if they actually work or not. Because a lot of people will say things. They'll make up stories about how things work without ever trying it. And I know this because I've done this. We find in lacrosse, I've worked in lacrosse and late prehistoric sites, and we have lots and lots and lots of end scrapers. They're little thumbnail-sized scrapers with a nice steep edge that are clearly used for scraping. Well, we know they're using a lot of hides because this is the only thing that they have to make clothing on. So obviously they were scraping the hides with the end scrapers. So one of my colleagues is Hunter. He goes out, he gets a deer, he pulls it off. It's all this gooey stuff on the inside of the hide. We tack it up outside the campus building, which probably wasn't a good place to do it, but and we make some of these scrapers, exact copies of some of these scrapers, and we give them to our students, and we put them on the end of sticks so that they're hafted, they're tied onto a stick, and we send them out with the students and say, now you can go out and use one of these, just like they did in the past. 10 minutes later, they come back in, throw them on the ground, and say, those don't work. We've got hundreds of them. They have to be good for something. Well, one of the things we made 2 errors in this that we discovered, and it was really important. First of all, we replicated our artifacts exactly like what we found. Well, the problem is, do you throw away perfectly good artifacts? No. So we had just replicated artifacts at the end of their lifespan when they weren't any good anymore. They wouldn't have thrown them away if they were good. So that was our first problem. And our second problem was that we figured that since all the goo on the back was what offended us the most, that's what they would be using these scrapers on. turns out our students just went back out on their own. They, cursed us and went back out and picked up flakes off the ground and used those and came back and said, piece of flake works fine. I don't know why we'd go through all the trouble of doing this. All you need is a sharp flake. And they'd finished processing all the goo off the back of this. We had a nice hide. Dried it, made a new batch of end scrapers with much shallower edges that would have probably been what the Native Americans would have started off with. Gave those to the students on a second try, and they said, ha, these work for dry hides. These work to scrape a dry hide to soften it. So without doing those experiments, and you'll see, we didn't do these until the 90s because, well, we know what they are. They're scrapers, obviously. But we didn't really understand very much of the process until we actually tried to do it. So experimenting is really important. And that's one of the reasons that we know, first, that these are heavy. Well, I can feel that it's heavy. They're hard to use. And they also take many, many, many hours to make. There are other artifacts. We've got a whole series of projectile points over here. These are beautiful artifacts. I'll steal the oldest one. So these artifacts look beautiful. They look like they would take a lot longer than these. And so I was like, well, this is just like you just kind of grind it down. If you know what you're doing, I'm not there yet, but if you knew what you were doing, it would probably take you about 2 or 3 hours to make one of these. Nice afternoon, not a big deal. If you know what you're doing, you're really, really good, and you're really efficient, 40 or 50. If you're like most of my students who are just learning about it, several hundred hours. So my students could make one of these in 2 or 3 times, 5 hours versus 100. So it also tells us what's more valuable. We would have assumed that these really pretty projectile points were more valuable because they're prettier. But these were an investment in time and labor. And we learned a lot of that because of some of this experimental work that we try. And that's one of the things that I like about teaching at UWL is because I have a horde of students each year who want to try something. They want to make something, they want to figure out how it was used. And we have legitimate questions about what to do with these things. So let's look in the past and figure out how we can infer the past from what we find. So one of the people who was working here with us over the weekend was Dan Joyce, who's at the Kenosha County Historical Society, and he has a couple of mammoths over there. People recognize what these are? Some of you guys do. So we've got a nice mammoth tooth here, and we've got a mastodon tooth here. So in the Kenosha Museum, we've got mammoth bones that have cut marks on them. They have places where there's lines cut into the bone. Now, animals could do that, but animals leave specific kinds of marks. Humans leave specific kinds of marks. And so one of the things that people have done to figure out, and we're still working on these bones that Dan has in the museum, is to look and see, well, what could have made these marks? And they take, one of my colleagues went to a zoo back when he was doing his graduate research and asked to go into the polar bear cages to collect up remnants of their dinners, their bones, so that he could see what kinds of marks do bears make on the bones. What kinds of marks do lions make on bones? What kinds of puncture marks do different kinds of animals? What kinds of marks do beavers make? What kinds of marks do rodents make? What kinds of marks do animals make on bones? And then what kinds of marks do humans make on bones? And then so to get the humans, you look at how modern people are butchering. Where do you cut? And we don't have any mammoths around here, although actually that same colleague, we were in Washington, D.C., and an elephant died in the zoo. And so he said, can we butcher it? Can we use stone tools to butcher this? And so they found out how big a kind of a tool you would need to do this. How hard is it to sever? I mean, these are big bones. And Dan mentioned at one point that he's finding cut marks on the inside of the pelvic bones. Why? What are you doing in there? Well, when you look at how to butcher and remove internal organs, your cut marks are ending up on the insides of the pelvic bones. So we can kind of infer some of the processes that are going on for these things. Because if you find something and you say, well, this is obviously killed by a human, well, what's your evidence of it? Do you have marks on that that tell you that it actually was killed by a human? So we can look specifically to find marks on the ground. We can also use those animals to infer the environment and the habitat that the people are living in. So around here, we have mammoth. Mammoth are grass eaters. And so there's a lot of grasses here, kind of eastern woodland grass environment. Mastodons eat shrubs and browse and things like that. In La Crosse, we get both. So we have, these are replicas, but MVAC has real teeth from both the mastodon and the mammoth from within 10 miles of the city of La Crosse, which means that we had both prairie environments and wooded environments at the end of the Ice Age. So how do we infer climatic patterns from something, 13, 15, 20,000 years ago? We can see what kinds of animals are there. Well, how do we know what habitats these are in? We can look at the habitats where they're found, but we can also look at the structure of their teeth. The mammoth has flat teeth. It grinds these things down. It's eating grasses. It's just got two teeth that plane against each other. The mastodon has teeth, these very big bumps. That's what the donts from the mastodon are. And so it's eating much rougher, much coarser material. So we can infer, even if we didn't have any evidence of where these had been found, we could look at their teeth based on modern animals' teeth that have the same patterns. We could use that analogy process and say, well, these things have to be eating pretty rough material. When students look at these, they always say these are carnivores. They always say these have to be meat eaters, which is kind of interesting because we're meat eaters. We're omnivores, but you think about our teeth. Our teeth are much flatter, actually. They have regular ridges, but these are really very, very irregular. These really are designed for something like deer teeth would be comparable for the kinds of browse for them. So these are all vegetarians. Or herbivores, I guess would be the appropriate term for animals. So we can figure out past environments by figuring out what animals were living there. We can figure out the habitats of the animals by modeling some of the types of physiology of the, particularly the teeth are very useful. And of course, a man-eating mammoth symbol. So we can reconstruct that past environment. We have here, we've put together, picture back 13,000 years ago. This area probably, were you out of the glaciers yet? You may have still had some glaciers covering portions right here. You might have just been on the edge of that.
Starts over toward Baraboo.
Yeah. So you're right on the edge of the ice sheet. Southwestern Wisconsin, where I work, was never covered with glaciers, which is why we have so much of this. We can put all that evidence together and say 13,000 years ago, people were roaming around hunting mastodons, mammoths, and many, many other game, probably bison, the buffalo that were here in the area, lots of elk, there were moose in the area. Deer hadn't kind of come in yet, they're a little bit further south. So we've got a hunter and gatherer population. And at that stage, when I say we've got a hunter-gatherer population, I've already jumped to, from observation, we've got teeth, we've got bones, we've got stone tools. These are some of the stone tools that they were using at that point. So these artifacts are probably about 10,000, 11,000 years old. And we know that based on the shape of the points. There are places where these have been found that have been radiocarbon dated. So we can find charcoal directly with one of these, say these points were made this far ago. We can then say that shape of the point, anytime we find that shape of point, we can date that particular deposit. And we do that today too. If you look at an old movie, and you look at the cars in the movie, and all the cars are old, 90s, whatever. then you can say, oh, I know what age that is. You know, I know when this was supposed to be set. And that's how projectile points work. So I can date this, I can make observations, I can make specific information about this based on the stone tools that I find. I can figure out the environment based on what else I find there. But how did I make the leap to saying, well, these are hunters and gatherers? We have very, very few human remains. We certainly don't have written records of how they were interacting. We don't have villages for them. We don't have communities. We just don't have very much evidence for them. We've got these and some scattered bone tools and flakes. We don't have a lot of other evidence for it. How do we go from these to saying, well, they're hunters and gatherers? Because that's another example of analogy. What lifestyle that we see in the world is associated with groups that are taking down mastodons and mammoths, that are living in an ice age kind of an environment. If we were to look worldwide, and in fact I'm teaching a course this fall on hunters and gatherers, where we compare modern examples of groups across the world living in a certain way, and look in the past to see what kinds of analogies those fit. And when we look to see what kinds of groups of people are hunting, part of that hunting and gathering, we have no evidence for the plants really, but no human society has succeeded without eating some sorts of plants. You know, your kids might not like fruits and vegetables, but they at some point probably ate them. And certainly by the adults. So we are now leaping. We're getting several steps away from observations to saying, even though I have no evidence that they were eating plants, if you're a healthy human, every healthy population that we know of that lives in an environment with edible plants eats them. Therefore, we're inferring. So we've gone from data to inference. By inference, they have to be eating plants. It just seems like a logical human step to do. So now we have a group that's hunting big game and eating whatever vegetation, whatever kinds of greens. There's not too many fruits at this time in this area. So it's going to be things like some of the greens and leaves and nuts and some kinds of things like that. So mostly meat. What kinds of lifestyles do hunters lead? Well, if you've got a group of 1 or 2 men and their families, they're not taking down an elephant. So we're looking at, but you also have a group of 500 people. There's no way that you can feed or organize that kind of group of people when most of the time you're hunting elk and bison and things like that. What kinds of groups of people have been successful in our knowledge of hunting these things? And so we come up with hunter-gatherers, and we make estimates that these people are probably living in groups of about 25 to 50 people. Make a further inference to say that these are all family groups. We don't actually know that there was a mother-father kind of situation there with the kids and the offspring, but we infer that there probably was some sort of pairing up that was reliable, that cared for the children. And we can also start making further inferences about the male and female roles. If you don't have successful resources to feed kids, all it is mom, then mom is pretty much with the kids for the first 4 or 5 years. So we can infer, based on biology of humans, based on analogy with other populations, that by and large women cared for the children, men went off and did the hunting. Children, I've never had children. Children, I understand, are noisy. They tend to be running around doing things. They are really good at many types of hunting and gathering. If you're living near a place that has nuts, they are really good at picking up those kinds of things off the ground. So they would be excellent at doing that kind of stuff. If you're living near a place that has lots of shellfish, they would be really good at harvesting the shellfish from the river. So there's lots of things that kids could be collecting that we figured the women were probably doing with the kids. And the men, by and large, would not be able to be with the kids most of the time if they're hunting. You take a little 2-year-old on a deer hunt, it's not going to work. Kid's not going to be quiet. I can see that we have a hunter here. He knows this is not going to work. So we can start inferring male and female roles in society based on some biological attributes that seem to work in most human societies prior to when we have a lot of the modern technology that we have today. But those are kind of inferences. And so when people say, what do you really know about the past? What I really know is they made these, and they hunted these, and I'm inferring a lot of other stuff. But I think they're pretty reasonable inferences. Anthropologists spend countless hours studying groups of people across the world. This is when a lot of us first learned about anthropology by reading about interesting groups of people who were living in exotic locales and doing different kinds of things. And it was interesting to see also how many similarities they had to our modern lives. Almost all societies that we know about have some concept of an other, something outside of whatever they're making, some sort of, we can call it a religion or a ritual or a spiritual element or some sort of thing. There's something out there that many, many societies seem to have. And so when we find items in our groups, so for instance, we have in western Wisconsin, and actually in central Wisconsin, there are a little bit later in time, about 11,000 years later than the hunters here, but there's still hunters and gatherers. We find burial mounds that are being built in the shape of animals. These are called effigy mounds, and there's a number of places in western and central and southern Wisconsin that will have hundreds of these in the shapes of bears. These are 2 bears here. There are places that will have birds. They will have what we call quadrupeds. They're animals with 4 limbs. We argue, what are they? Are they wolves? Are they bears? There's things that look like turtles. There's things that look sort of like turtles but have a really, really, really long tail. And then we start talking to the Ho-Chunk, and they'll say, well, those are probably parts of these long-tailed water spirits that they're making burial mounds in the shapes of some of these very different kinds of spiritual animals. So prior to this time period, they weren't building mounds of that. That doesn't mean religion started at this point. It just means we don't have physical evidence of it earlier. So there's a pretty good bet that people are doing a lot of this kind of, where's my art? Yeah. So, you know, there are earlier than that, there are just conical mounds where they're burying their dead. Does this mean that they developed a whole new strategy of understanding of animals, or do they just choose a different way to bury their dead? So we start getting into inferences about how people could live. So that's some of the ideas about how we go about figuring out how people live. Questions on that before we go through the rest of these time periods to see what they were doing. So when we started off by saying they're hunters and gatherers, the end of the Ice Age, killing these mastodons, mammoths. You know, you kill one of these, you're living in an area that is probably for 9-10 months snow covered. It's basically you're living in a freezer. You've got a lot of food. You get even a moose or a bison, you've got hundreds of pounds of meat. You get a kill of any sort, you can just kind of settle down right there, live for a long time on your frozen food. But about 10,000, the glaciers start retreating. They're pretty much gone by about 10,000 years ago. And this area starts looking more and more like modern. How do we know that? Because we start seeing some of the artifacts and the materials that are being found in the area change. We no longer have evidence of mastodons, we have evidence of deer. So we find the deer antlers, we find the deer bones, we find evidence of cut marks on the antler, cut marks on the bones. So they're hunting deer. Well, what kind of habitat does deer live in? It lives in a wooded habitat with a lot of open areas, kind of savanna areas. So we can start reconstructing what the habitat looks like based on what kinds of material we find. We find these axes. These axes start in this period. This first period is called Paleo. The second period is called Archaic. With the Archaic, we first find these axes. So all of a sudden, they're cutting down trees to do stuff. So why would you cut down trees? There's lots of different reasons you might. Why might you need to cut down a tree?
Build a house.
So you might want to be building a house. So they weren't doing that. As far as we can tell, they weren't cutting down trees. First of all, there may not have been many trees at the edge of the ices. But they also may have been in Siberia. There are houses that were made out of some of the bones. We don't see that here. Perhaps they were using igloos, which work again. We use analogy. Igloos work great up in the Arctic. Why cut down trees when you've got all the snow? It works just fine. The snow goes, you need to have some sort of shelters. So we find them cutting down trees probably for housing. They probably can use a lot of dry wood for firewood, but you need to get some pretty good trees to build houses. So we can start inferring other kinds of activities from the kinds of artifacts we have. So with the Archaic, we start also seeing grinding stones. And why do you need to grind stones? You know, they're not grinding meat. About the only things really that you grind are some of those plants. So all of a sudden we're pretty sure we've got good evidence now that they are harvesting plants and they're processing them. And so we think they're probably processing a lot of things such as nuts. We start finding fragments. Now, nuts you wouldn't think would last, and they don't last unless they're fully charred. But I have found thousands and thousands of years old nuts around a fireplace, and the only reason that nuts will preserve is if they get into a fire. So why would nuts get into a fire? What kinds of activities? You're sitting around a campfire cracking it, right? But what do you do with those nutshells? Exactly, you throw them in the fire. And it turns out that the nutshells are really good fuel. So there's, and this is important because we find a lot of the kinds of nuts that are really good fuel to go in the fire. The other kind of nut, my dissertation looked at all the different kinds of resources in the area and compared the nutritional value of walnuts and hickory and hazel and acorn. Turns out hazelnuts are one of the most nutritious nuts. The little filberts, we call them today, they're a variety. Really nutritious, even more nutritious than walnuts and hickory. We find very few hazelnuts. They're a thinner shell, they're not a terribly good fuel, and so they're just not getting into the fire. So I'm faced with the problem. I like having data. I like being able to support my inferences with data. My data says that they were eating lots of hickories and walnuts, which I think they were. But the data doesn't say that they're also eating lots of hazelnuts. Although my analogy and my inference about human behavior says these were everywhere, because that's what the deer were eating. The deer loved those. They were eating the acorns and the hazelnuts. They had to be in the environment. They were highly edible. Today they're really tasty. People must have been eating them. We just don't have the archaeological evidence of them. So I'm drawing an inference that says even though some things are present, and I can demonstrate that, I'm inferring that other things are also present because everything about human behavior says that they should be there. So we're starting to get a little bit further from that solid, what evidence do you have for things, kind of a step, but it's a pretty reasonable step. And how do people live if you're living as a hunter and gatherer? And we know they've got lots and lots, the environment around here is incredibly rich. So lots and lots of deer and turkeys and raccoons. I think we take these boxes out for the kids to figure out what is in the environment. Lots of deer, lots of prairie, lots of bison, lots of raspberries, a lot of sand. So this is how the axe, this axe would have been hafted with a little, it's heavy, a little haft across that. But one of the things we also find, we said that people did a lot of ritual. They buried their dead in specific shapes much later, but starting at some point, we're not sure when, but at some point, probably in the Archaic, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, they started doing rock art. They started doing carvings and paintings on the walls. They probably did it much earlier, they just didn't survive. Again, if you go back to what do kids do if you stick a kid in front of anything that leaves a residue on a surface, a piece of charcoal, a stick out of the fire, and that hide that he's been sitting on. They're carving things, they're drawing things on there. It's almost guaranteed that these kinds of things were being done on perishable materials, on hides, on bark, on baskets. We don't have evidence of it. We start seeing evidence of carvings and paintings. So this is from Hole in the Wall Cave in Iowa County, and you can see if you look at it, it's a deer. Here's the head of it. Here's the legs. It's that little triangular point going in, that little heart line going in. It's a deer, but it's a deer with an arrow into the middle of it. So what is that suggesting? The same kind of imagery of animals with darts into them is found over in Europe at the Upper Paleolithic in France. The cave art over there has images of animals with darts going into them, heartline images. We have here carvings and paintings of animals with darts and heart lines in them. So we said before we can make connections, historic connections, if we see things in two different areas. Does that mean that these people are related to the people in Europe 17,000 years ago, or that people tend to do the same kinds of things in many different places? And it's actually a big argument. There's a group of people who want to say that, in fact, the Solutrean in France 20,000 years ago is an ancestor of what we see here today. I think it's more likely, it's far more likely, that people just do. You've seen an animal, you've killed an animal, it's got an arrow in it. That's how you killed it, or a dart. I'm going to draw a picture of that. So and this is where we really don't know what these mean. Is this just a story? I had a good hunt. See, I'm telling you about it. And here's a picture of it. Is this a sign to those spirits beyond to say, I'd like to do this. This would be what my goal is. Make this happen. Is this a thanks to the spirit of the deer? We know that many, many groups will make an offering to the animal that gave himself so that we could eat. We don't know how to interpret these, so we're not even going to try with those. But there's lots and lots of different ways of doing it, and the way that we would figure that out is by talking to all the people who use these kinds of imagery and seeing, well, this is what we think ours means, and we can kind of get an idea of the range of interpretation some of these things might be. So what was lifestyle like at this time? They're hunting deer. We've got a lot of evidence for that. They've got a lot of different animals in their environment. We know they're making some sorts of houses. The other place where we find them living, see here's some of those rock art images. These are images on the outside or on the inside wall of a caves, rock shelters. There's a lot of rock shelters in this area where we think the people were living in the winter. It's cold in Wisconsin in the winter, and you really don't want to cut down enough trees to be able to keep a fire going in the middle of a field in the middle of winter. That's just a lot of work. When you have a nice rock shelter, equivalent of caves over in places that have caves, around here we have rock shelters that aren't terribly deep. They might be 10 to 15 feet deep, maybe 20 or 30 feet long. They often have a kind of a low overhang. But when you go in there, and I take my groups of students, I take groups of like 20 students in there, we go stand in there, and we say, well, we could fit kind of comfortably here. You know, we could all stretch out. You put some 4 or 5 hides across the middle. You've got basically an enclosed area. Took no trees. You can build up a fire. You've got bones. We know they're burning bones. They're burning nuts. They're burning the wood they have. You could be pretty comfortable in there. So they're living, and again, we're inferring that that's where they are. We find the artifacts in there for them. What season are they living in there? We can actually find the jaws of the deer, and we can date the season that the deer were killed by looking at how old they are. So a young deer is born in about April or May. If we find it 8 or 9 months old, it was killed in the middle of winter. They have looked at all of the deer in these caves, and they say these are midwinter kills. These are late fall to early spring kills, that they're living in rock shelters, eating deer, and drawing on the walls. This is what people do. You've got a flat surface, you've got a piece of charcoal in your hand, they're decorating these walls. Not all of it survived, a lot of it does. So how do we infer the size of the group? Well, we've got the caves and rock shelters they're living in hold about 20 to 25 people comfortably. We're inferring that's about the size of those groups. The kicker is that you can have lots of small groups of 20 to 25 people living around the environment, and they'll do just fine, except that when the young people mature, they have to be able to find marriage partners. Some sort of, again, we don't know what their mating practices were. There's some sort of mating system because they procreated, and we do not see evidence that virtually any group is marrying and having offspring within their own group. The only groups that do that are groups like the pharaohs in Egypt and the royal houses in Europe, which, you know, just saying, it's not a good idea biologically. Native Americans knew better. And so what we think they're doing is periodically, all of these groups of 25 to 30 people that are scattered, living hunter-gatherer lifestyles around the landscape, and most of the time they're moving to their resources. So in the middle of the summer, they go down to the river and they fish and they gather all the plants there. In the winter, they're in the interior in these nice shelters. Periodically, they have to get together at some point. Where do they do that? Well, Adam has a card here from artifacts that were found from this area. I know where these raw materials came from. This is a very distinctive raw material. It's called Hickston silicified sandstone, and it comes from Jackson County. It comes from by the town of Hickston in Jackson County, which is about an hour and a half drive away from here. So it's probably a good 100 miles. They were found here. This stone is found over probably a 500 or to 1,000 mile spread. This stone is found in southern Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, out west through Iowa, Minnesota, into the Dakotas. This particular stone is a really good stone. They really liked it. And it's a very distinctive part on the landscape. At Silver Mound, we find stone from Ohio, southern Indiana, southern Illinois, the Dakotas, all the people. So what we're inferring is that the people from all around the place, hundreds of miles span, would get together periodically, probably spread the word. At certain point in the year, we're all going to gather at Silver Mound. They're bringing all of their materials, all of their toolkits that they made in their local area. They're bringing them here. When they get to the source of this really good material, they dump out their old points and they make new ones. They take the new material back with them. So what they're doing is they're leaving a record of all of the places that they've come from, and they're dropping them. So at Silver Mound, we have a record of an enormous trade network and travel network that's being represented there. So we think that this is how periodically, every year or two, there's macro band gatherings. Minor bands or micro band gatherings, these 25 or 30 people groups, 4 or 5 related adults with their parents and their siblings. But then periodically, every couple of years, there's macro band gatherings. How big are those? Well, again, we go back to analogy. We go back to looking at modern populations. How big of a modern population, and statisticians do all the fancy numbers to say, how many people do you need to have in a community such that if you're careful with how you're breeding, you don't end up with any inbreeding problems. It's about 500 people. We look at the range and the distribution of the sites. It seems perfectly reasonable to think of groups of about 300 to 500 people gathering at Silver Mound every couple of years, at which point all of the young people can find their mates. You now have lots and lots and lots of potential partners, mixing and matching, exchanging information, exchanging ideas, exchanging stones. If you really don't like the people you've been with, you really have had it with your brother, I mean, really, you can move to another group. And it's a very easy flow and exchange, because for much of this time period, we don't see a lot of evidence of conflict. It's a we just don't see warfare. We don't see signs of it. But we do see signs of large group exchange of information, large group population movements. But we also can't believe that people are living in groups. If you have a group of 500 people living for more than a couple of weeks, it leaves a mark on the landscape. And we don't see those marks on the landscape yet. We see signs of small groups living everywhere, but we don't see house structures. We see caves that are small. There's not enough room to put hundreds of people in there. So we think they're still living in small groups for most of the year, moving seasonally. And that's a great story up until about 500 BC. So about from about 13,000 years ago to about 500 BC. So we've got, over 10,000 years of small group hunters and gatherers living on the environment. About 500 BC, or about 2,500 years ago, everything changes. So up until this point, if you wanted to boil something, we take this for granted, you put a pot on the stove. Well, they didn't have pottery. Pottery wasn't invented until 500 BC. If you wanted to boil something, you put it in a skin or you put it in some sort of a basket. But if you put a basket on the fire, unless you keep the water right up to the top, the whole thing goes up in smoke. And again, we know this because we've tried this. And you make a basket and say, oh, this is good, I want to cook in here. And it works great, and it works great. And then you get distracted for 5 minutes and you realize the water level has dropped and your pot goes up in smoke. It's really hard to cook with a skin or a basket. These are fire things. This is not easy. So by and large, up until this point, we're not seeing a lot of, we don't think of dinner as being a stew. It's more in the order of things that you can skewer on the spit, and maybe stuff that you can cook for a while, but it takes an intensive effort. You can stone boil things. You can heat a stone up and you put the stone in the basket and that heats up the water, and then you take the stone out and you put it back in the fire. This again is tedious. It's not an easy process to boil a stew until 500 years ago, 500 BC, when they start making pottery. Pottery, I don't have examples of it because it's really thick, it's really crude, but they could put a pot on the fire and they could boil food. And that was a revolutionary change. And it did a number of things in the society. First of all, you could put a pot on the fire and just let it cook. You could put food in there and you could cook it for an hour, and you can start getting food that's softer, that's kind of mushy. And what we see a change, seeing a lot, dinner, diet. They're still eating the deer and everything else. They're still eating the nuts. They're grinding up the nuts. They start eating different kinds of seeds. Goosefoot seeds become really popular now. You know these as lamb's quarters. You've probably ripped a lot of them out of your garden and they said they're weeds. Well, they are weeds, but they are very productive weeds that produce quinoa is the equivalent of it. If we stopped ripping them out of our gardens, we could be harvesting local quinopodium, except that most cities have declared them a noxious weed, and we can't grow them. I tried to grow them in our campus garden, and the city informed me these were noxious weeds. And I said, no, these are Native American horticultural, agricultural products. And I said, no, those are noxious weeds. So quinoa, basically, that's what they were growing, the local equivalent of here. It's not terribly edible until you start boiling it, right? You guys haven't probably eaten it raw. You can start cooking this food. So what are they cooking? I mean, they're cooking some stews probably, undoubtedly. But what they can start cooking is foods that they can boil, soft and mushy to porridges, to make a weaning food to feed the babies. Because up until this point, mama was the source of food. You really, a 2 or 3 year old kind of can eat some solid foods, but steaks are, kind of a challenge to them. And if you can't cook soft foods, mom is probably nursing until the kid, at least partially, until the kid is 2 or 3 years old. So there's about a 4 year, then when she stops nursing, she can become pregnant again. If you're not ultra well fed like we are today, if you're on kind of a basic environment, if you're nursing, you're probably not going to become pregnant. So there's a natural birth order that's being imposed here. Kids are being born about every 4 years. And this is what we see again in populations all around the world that are still doing things that way. But when you can boil food, you can make a porridge to feed that kid, all of a sudden you can start weaning that kid at 1, 2, it's a lot earlier. So mom becomes pregnant again. So now rather than having a 4-year-old and a newborn, which mom can carry, the 4-year-old can more or less come with the parents as you're going off to go. Mom now has a 4-year-old, maybe a 2-year-old, and a baby. She's like, I'm not moving. There's no way I am moving. You men, you go off, do whatever you want. We're settling down right here, and this is where we'll be. You come back and you find us. We see a dramatic population increase. The number of sites goes up markedly. The size of the sites goes up markedly. We start finding houses. We start finding villages where it looks like we might have 10 or 15 houses in a village. That's what this woodland period mark says. Then as soon as they start making pottery, they keep with it. It's good. So we see population increasing. We see the size of the communities increasing. And we see them settling down in much more limited areas. What happens when you're roaming across the landscape and you're hunting animals all over creation, and they're just wandering across the landscape, where's my deer? You've got lots of land, and if your neighbor comes up and they want to hunt there, it's like, whatever, I'll just go to the next valley. If you've settled down and you've built houses, you're kind of attached to that land. This is when they start burying their dead on that land. They are literally laying claim to that land by saying, these are our ancestors right here. This is our land. We start seeing evidence of these kinds of territorial areas, which we hadn't seen before. And once you start having territorial areas, you start having conflicts. Before, if you were looking after the neighbor's valley over to the west, and it looked pretty good, but somebody was living there, it's like, oh, well, I'll go east. Now we see by about 1,000 years after they start making pottery, we start seeing the landscape filling up. We start seeing sites almost everywhere that we look. And we call this landscape packing. There are sites, they are filling the landscape. They are reaching carrying capacity on the landscape. So they're still hunters, they're still gatherers, but they're now starting, they haven't become agriculturalists yet, but they've settled down long enough that they can plant some things. So they're planting this chenopodium, this goosefoot. They're planting sunflowers. They've domesticated sunflowers, which are highly nutritious, right? The sunflower seeds, the oil. They are planting different kinds of gourds, and they're growing all of these things. So they're getting attached to the land, and they're putting an investment in the particular land. They're getting more nutrition. They're getting a very good diet, but they're also getting a lot more people. And we think that at about 1000 AD, They're still just gardeners. They're not farmers yet. But by 1000 AD, they have filled the landscape of southern Wisconsin. Northern Wisconsin is still kind of more open because it really isn't a good place to farm, even back then. Although there's some cornfields up there about 1000 AD. They were pushing their limits. But by 1000 AD, we think that this landscape was full. Hunters, gatherers, gardeners. And so we've got our next scenario is of people making the pottery and living in some of these nice little structural houses. And we don't see signs that they're all going into the shelters in the winter anymore because we don't think there's enough room for them. We used to never see signs of winter sites down on the river because it's cold. It's miserable living along the Mississippi River in the middle of winter. We start seeing signs of winter sites down there. And again, inference, the only reason they're there is because there's no other place for them to be, because the interior is filled by other groups. And in fact, all the rock shelters are full. So at 1000 AD, we're in a scenario where we have lots and lots of people, lots of land, territories being developed. And then something happens. And this is where we really don't know exactly what it is. But down in East St. Louis, the same process is going on all across the Midwest. In East St. Louis at a site called Cahokia, if you ever get a chance to visit it, it is the most amazing site. A city emerges. Not a little village, community, city, sort of the way, big city for them. No, a city. 20 to 40,000 people. At 1050 AD, there's at least 20,000 people living in East St. Louis in Illinois. In an urban area, there's a platform mound that is comparable in size to the pyramids, and there is somebody living on top of that. Probably a very important person. There's burials at this site. There's a burial mound there that has a man and a woman that were buried. Associated with them were 50 young women between the ages of 18 and 24 that were laid out next to each other in stacks, all killed at the same time. Is this a natural death? Probably not. There are 4 young men about the same age. They were laid out next to each other with their heads cut off, their hands cut off, laid next to each other. Not a natural death. So there's power down there. Cahokia has probably a family lineage that for 3 or 4 generations, extremely charismatic, brought people together, and they had known about corn, kind of gardening for it. They started systematic, intensive corn agriculture. That was what the basis of their society was on, because none of these other ways of living work if you have a city like that. If you have 40,000 people living on a prairie in Illinois, you don't have enough deer. You've overfished probably. You can't use any of the other wild resources. You have to have a large agricultural This is the basis of our economy. It's the basis of their economy. And so we start seeing at 1050 to 1200 AD, there's a city down there with power. And it comes up here. Astaland in eastern Wisconsin by Lake Mills is an outpost of them. Up in Trempealeau, just north of La Crosse, there's outposts for them. So these people are traveling and trading all over this area. They're coming up into Wisconsin, and there's a village that has, I talked about end scrapers, hundreds of little end scrapers that we think they were coming up here to get deer. People from Illinois come into Wisconsin to hunt deer, right? They still do this today. They were doing it back then, and they were probably shipping the meat back. So we see something happens and a change occurs in the society. And this is where we really don't know what the transformative process was. So I say something happened. I don't know. And everything changes. Society after that is no longer living in small communities of 15, 25 people. It's living in villages. Corn agricultural systems change. Again, it's a different way. How do we know how to live with an agricultural society. We look at ethnographic examples. For this, we're getting close enough that we have some very good records from the early historic era of people living as corn agriculturalists. We have good records of that. We can talk to the Ho-Chunk and say, what was life like with all of this? So what they add to their processing besides just the corn is beans. So they're growing corn and beans. They had squash already. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. This is the basis for the agricultural system that the Europeans encountered, that the Ho-Chunk were living, that the Native Americans in southern Wisconsin were living when they contacted people here. But they're living now in villages. We count a village, a couple hundred people. And we find evidence now of these villages. In La Crosse, there are sites that will have several thousand garbage pits, storage pits. They dug the pits to store all the corn. This is why you're growing corn, to store it, so you have a surplus so you can eat it over the year. They're storing the food there. They're living in large villages. So it's a very different way of life, but that doesn't start until about 1000 AD. So 12,000 years, they're living hunting, gathering, fishing way of life until the population is so large that they really need to have an additional source of food. So they become agriculturalists. And at that stage, basically, that's what the culture that the Europeans encountered. So with the Native Americans and the agriculturalists, we can look at some more of the ethnographic record. We can look at farming communities. We have good records. The Ho-Chunk can tell us about some of their life ways from the past. We get further back, we're doing a lot more inference about what seems logical. And that always means that it might be wrong. And the more that we do for real research, we can start getting more and more information about what might have been happening. But that's also why we find it really important to study other living groups that are living in different ways of life and doing different kinds of experimental or reconstructions, rendezvous kinds of activities. This is a bison shoulder blade, a modern one. These are what they would have used. We processed this down. If we hafted this, this would be a hoe. This would be a garden tool. And we have made a number of these, and we use these. And the wear patterns we get on them exactly match the wear patterns we get from our archaeological tools. So we're still doing a lot of that kind of experimental work to figure out how to interpret these things. So we have a lot of data for things, but we also make a lot of leaps. That I try to tell my students that you can make these leaps, but you've got to be conscious of when you're making them, so that you know what you know. I know that they were at Silver Mound. I infer they were there in large group gatherings doing this, that, and the other thing, so that we can kind of build on what we know and understand the basis for it. So with that, questions? Yes?
With dogs, was there anything in these digs or anything that dogs were involved?
Dogs were definitely here. It's a good point. They probably came over with Native Americans in the very beginning. We have no reason we don't see dogs specifically in the archaeological record until about 9,000 years ago, but they are companion animals from then on, and they probably were here earlier. We just don't have evidence of them. We know they were being domesticated in Europe even prior to that, almost definitely came over and throughout this. In fact, one of the things that we find is that we have been testing. One of the students in Milwaukee just did his dissertation. Dogs, those of you who have dogs know, dogs eat garbage. They eat anything. And when I had a dog and a cat, the dog thought that the cat's litter box was basically just its treat bowl. Okay, so dogs are eating everything that humans are eating, plus often they're eating lots of bits of what the humans got rid of. So we wanted to find out, we can do a lot of chemical isotope analyses on animals to find out what kinds of things they were eating. For deer, it doesn't tell us much. We know what they're eating. That's pretty modern. But when we do those same things with dogs, we can find out what humans are eating. People have done studies to see how comparable is the dog's diet to the human diet. It's pretty comparable. If you're not actually feeding the dog food, the dog is basically foraging in your village for your garbage, which is what probably almost all these animals were doing, then its diet, so how much corn were people eating? How much meat versus all these other things? They will actually be able to look at the isotopes in the dogs and make inferences about what the people were doing. So we find evidence of dogs chewing bones at almost all of these sites. We can find, again, we recognize students have taken bones home and they give them to their pet dogs, small dogs, medium dogs, large dogs. What kinds of patterns are these developed? The only tricky part about that is getting the bone back after you've given it to the dog. Sometimes they really don't want to give it back. So we can look and see, we've actually been able to figure out how big these dogs are. They're about 20 to 40 pounds or so, kinds of animals. Probably not pets, probably more likely working animals. Protection, they would have given alerts if somebody was coming, a stranger was coming, hunting animals and so forth. So these would have been good working animals. These would have been good companion animals in the community. So dogs would have been a very important part of this whole process, yeah.
If you give a real quick synopsis of when the Indians were growing corn, they used ridged fields.
Yep, that's right, because we've excavated a series of sites that he was on. Today we tend to plant the corn in furrows. You know, the equipment goes down. Well, the Native Americans built ridges, and they put the corn on top of the ridges, and they grew beans along the sides of the ridges. And if they plant the corn, we discovered this by experiments, you plant the corn about a week or two earlier than the beans will spiral up the corn so they can use the corn as their pole, and then you plant squashes lower down on the area, and the squashes, the big leaves, cover the ground, smother the weeds, prevent more evaporation, keep moisture in the ground. And it's a really good symbiotic system. And we actually found the ridges in La Crosse, these huge fields, hundreds of acres of fields. But the way we find the fields is there's 10 or 15 ridges to go like this, and there's 10 or 15 ridges to go like this, and there's 10 or 15 ridges over here. So we think these are all family groups. We can see kind of little different angles for them. The important things about growing on ridges, and we discovered this also when there was a heavy storm, and the local farmers just lost most of their corn because the rain just flushed down and washed out all the corn in the furrows. The corn in our garden was sitting on top of the ridges, and it was fine. So it was a very successful system. The beans provide nitrogen back into the soil. All of the vegetation from the corn stubble and everything else recycled back into the ground. In these ridged field systems, we also found places where they were taking all of their village garbage. So we find a pit that was filled with old fish bones. And today, if you talk to fishermen, what are they doing with the old fish bones? They're probably burying them in the garden because it's a good fertilizer. Well, we're finding these pits in these ridged field systems of fish bones, probably the residue from fishing for these things as fertilizer. And we find layers of these. If they got silted over, they would build them up again. Silted over, they'd build them up again. So very successful agricultural system for that. We find there's probably garden beds throughout the area. We think that there might be garden beds. They're recorded at historic times. There are either Indian hills, you'll see references to hills, where there's just single plants. We have ridges where they're putting a little hill on top of these ridges. So kind of depending on the areas for them. So it's a symbiotic system that was very successful and was ecologically very sound. Other questions? Give you a chance also to look at some of the artifacts over there and some of the stuff up here. So I can take any other questions that you have.
Thank you. Well, as you all know, we have one more presentation coming up next Tuesday. This weekend, we also have an opportunity to come out and get involved in the archaeology dig, which Dr. Arzigian is leading here. Your family can come out and actually participate in the dig, where we're trying to find the 1830s blacksmith shop here. So, good opportunity to get your hands dirty, get involved firsthand with that. So, thank you again.
Yeah, we actually found some flakes, so we know the Ho Chunk were here, and apparently it's probably still making some stone tools. It's kind of fun. So Adam says that he's got drawers of them. These were all found from the counties around here.
Mostly from down around Columbia, Dane, Jefferson, I think whatever those county is down below that, but generally here in South.
So if you want to try and figure out how old they are, we have a point guide. You can match them up and see how the styles change over time.